Great. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this meeting. And thank you also to the previous two speakers who have raised some issues that I'm going to explore further in my presentation. So what I want to do today in thinking about some of the ethical issues that we need to consider when it comes to genome editing in agriculture is, first of all, to point out that genetic modification, whether it be of plants, animals, or humans, is not a new issue. So we have been, ever since the recombinant DNA era and indeed earlier, been thinking about the potential of genetic modification to change the world around us, the organisms we share it with, and even ourselves. So one of the questions that I think we need to consider is whether genome editing represents, as it has been called, a step change, a game changer, but are the ethical issues different, or are we simply talking about more of the same? So what changes now that genome editing has become a reality? I want to cover 4 sections in my talk today. One is to very quickly go over some general arguments about genetic modification. And as I said, these are not new arguments. These are, I'm sure, arguments you'll have heard when it comes to thinking about genetic modification and your own work. But they are arguments that nevertheless, when we think about how we present the possibility of genome edited animals to different publics, when we talk about the societal implications, the ethical issues, these are arguments that are going to come up. So I'll go over those very quickly as an overview. But then I want to turn to looking at 3 aspects in particular that I think raise some new dimensions of genome editing and ethics that we may not fully have considered, and how we use those to grapple with the problems or the ethical concerns around genome editing in agriculture today. Okay, so those are the 4 basic sections of the talk that I'm going to attempt to cover in the next 18 or so minutes. Okay, so a quick overview of general arguments around genetic modification. And as I say, these I'm sure will be arguments that you've heard before. So a common category of arguments around genetically modifying animals is what we might call the yuck factor, or the argument from repugnance. People just say, well, it's just wrong. I just don't like the idea of it. This is often associated with an argument from naturalness. So to say it's unnatural, that tampering with nature is somehow wrong, or that tampering with nature is dangerous. Now, I want to point out that that latter version is actually an argument about risk. And having just heard a much more detailed explication of how we ought to go about assessing risk when it comes to the use of genome editing technologies, I think we can agree that simply to say it's unnatural, therefore it's dangerous, is a fallacy. And to say it might be dangerous, therefore we shouldn't do it, is also a fallacy. Okay, but those are the sort of yuck factor arguments that we might contend with. And we might respond to that just because one person is uncomfortable with something or doesn't like it doesn't mean it's necessarily morally wrong. We could point to many historical taboos that people have said, well, it's just wrong in the past. So, for example, miscegenation and homosexuality used to be things with which people were uncomfortable, they thought were just wrong. And I hope nowadays we are not of such a determined opinion that these things are actually universally morally wrong. We might also say, well, just because someone doesn't like it, okay, it's wrong to you, but does that give a person the right to decide for everyone else? So when we talk about not just what will we accept as individuals, but what should we do in terms of regulation, in terms of social control of technologies, just because some people don't like the idea of genetic modification doesn't mean that they have the right to decide for everyone else that we shouldn't do it. My somewhat facetious response to arguments from repugnance is that I personally happen to think bananas are repugnant, but that doesn't give me the right to say, well, we should ban bananas. Okay, so when it comes to arguments from the natural, we should recognize that nature isn't a moral force as such. Genomes of animals and of humans and of plants as they exist are the product of random events in the course of evolution. We, of course, already intervene in nature in many ways, including by selective breeding. And it's very difficult to draw the lines between what is natural and what is unnatural. Humans, we might argue, are themselves part of nature, and therefore anything we do surely must be encompassed within the natural. Okay, related to these arguments, however, we have another class of arguments that is sometimes described shorthand as playing God. Now, when people claim that genetically modifying animals is playing God, they are often not making a theological argument as such. So what's actually going on here? And I would say that the argument from playing God is actually an argument about an improper exercise of agency. So we're trying to do something that we perhaps don't have the right to do, don't have the knowledge to do, ought not to be doing. So humans messing around with the genomes of other organisms, it might be argued, is somehow an improper exercise of our agency. We might say it shows a lack of appropriate humility and a sort of humbleness about our place in the universe being not to mess with things. Now, I would say that this is also often actually a risk-based argument in disguise. So the idea that we're meddling with things we don't understand and something might therefore go wrong is actually an argument about risk. And so we should deal with that in terms of the ethical evaluation of risk. But we might also respond to such arguments by asking what the limits are of proper agency and why genome editing or genetic modification exceeds such limits. So is it because we are creating life or creating different life forms? Is it because we're making choices when we carry out genome editing that affect the lives of other creatures? And of course, we already do this. So this is not in itself an argument as to why we shouldn't perform genome editing on animals. Most importantly, I think, why should we regard humility as the most valuable goal? So should we say, because we are humble, we know our place, and we shouldn't interfere with the genomes of plants and animals, that we're going to give up all the potential benefits that genetic modification could bring? And when I say benefits here, I mean not just benefits to humans who reap the fruits of agriculture, but, as we've just heard, potential benefits to animals themselves. Okay, so thus far, the kinds of arguments we've dealt with, I would say in many cases, are actually an argument about risk in a roundabout way. So it's either it's unnatural, it's too dangerous, it's messing with something we don't understand, that's dangerous. So we need to ask what the proper approach is to ethical risk evaluation. As I said, we've just had a very detailed exposition about risk assessment, and I think that this has been it's been a great example of what an ethical approach to risk evaluation should entail, which includes the proper gathering and weighing of evidence, the evaluation of both the magnitude and the likelihood of risks, and so forth. I'm going to say a little bit more about ethical risk evaluation later on, not just in terms of how we evaluate risks, but what sorts of risks we need to be looking at and how. Another argument that might come up is that we're somehow, in modifying animals or plants to suit our own purposes, that we are instrumentalizing or commodifying life. Now, of course, again, this is a potential problem for agriculture in general, not just genome editing. So if we ought not to be using animals for our own purposes, that's a problem for agriculture, not only genetic modification. But I want to probe a little bit deeper and ask whether a concern about instrumentalization, we are using animals for our own purposes, we are using them to benefit ourselves, is this actually a problem about interests? So who benefits? Is it that animals are being harmed and humans are benefiting? And is it about the balance of those? Or is it about power? Is it about who's in control? So perhaps animals are benefiting as well as humans. Some of the examples in the previous talk show that actually it can be mutually beneficial for animals and humans to apply genome editing. But perhaps if humans are ultimately in control of this process, there's a concern there over who has the power over this situation. So again, we'll come back to that. And then finally, we have concerns about the societal effects of genome editing, whether it be the effect of commercialization, whether it be concerns about who has access to technology and what the consequences of unequal access might be, whether it be concerns about global justice and about equity. And so I'm going to suggest that one of the ways in which we can address these concerns is through thinking about regulation of technology and how we control the distribution of genome editing technologies. Okay, so moving on to three types of argument into which I want to probe in a bit more detail. So the first of those concerns the relationship between risk and what is natural. Now, as I said, nature in and of itself is not a moral force. And yet much of our existing approach towards how we want to evaluate risk and how we regulate genetically modified organisms does depend on making a distinction between what's natural and what is somehow not natural, what is foreign or human engineered. So the regulation of genetically modified organisms in many countries, for example, draws the distinction between natural methods of breeding that simply use genetic variation that already exists, and the types of genetic modification procedure that involve introducing new genes that perhaps aren't already within the population, that come, say, from another species. I think it's interesting to note that humans are not exempt from this distinction. So this is an excerpt from the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine report on human genome editing that came out about 5 years or so ago now. And you can see that one of the restrictions they proposed to impose on the use of genome editing technology in humans was a restriction. This is very small text, I'm afraid, but looking at the fourth bullet point down, they suggested a restriction to genome editing to versions that are prevalent in the population and known to be associated with ordinary health with little or no evidence of adverse effects. So we should limit it to what already exists within the human gene pool. Okay, so is this a sensible approach? Is this precautionary, or is it the naturalistic fallacy where we say that what is natural is somehow inherently better? I'm going to suggest it's a little bit of both. But natural is not necessarily safer. So here we need to think not only about what we're doing, but what else we might be doing. If we're performing genome editing in animals, the alternatives are to not modify anything, to use other modes of genetic modification, to use, say, mutagenesis. This is much more common in plant crops than animals, but to use mutagenesis to create new variation, or to use traditional selective breeding. And it's not entirely clear that genome editing is necessarily more dangerous than any of these options. So, for example, other modes of genetic modification also may produce unexpected mutations or off-target effects. Mutagenesis obviously produces all sorts of mutations, and traditional selective breeding has an opportunity cost in terms of being limited to the genetic variants that already exist in the population. So, what's natural is not necessarily better or more beneficial. One of the key points within the discussion over how we regulate genetically modified organisms is whether we should regulate based on the process or on the outcome. So if we attain by genome editing more quickly, more easily, more cheaply, and with more certainty, more safely, something that we could have done in another way, such as traditional selective breeding, are we going to say that simply because it involves what we might call genetic modification, those organisms should be regulated differently? Of course, the advantage that we do have with naturally occurring genetic variation, with the natural, is that there is an existing evidence base. So this allele, this variant is present in the population. We have some evidence as to what it does. But what should we do in the absence of evidence? So simply to say, well, we know about this variant and we don't know about that one, isn't enough to say, well, that one is just too risky. What do we do when we don't have evidence? What do we do in terms of the unknown? And in order for our ethical approach to risk not to deteriorate merely into a fear of the unknown, something might happen, you never know what, therefore we shouldn't do it, or to lift a phrase from Cornford's Microcosmographia Academica, nothing should ever be done for the first time because we don't know what might happen, the dangerous precedent. So if our attitude to risk is not to deteriorate merely into the fear of the unknown, how should we confront the potential risks and the uncertainties, the unknowns of genome editing? We can do research. We can engage in educated prediction, we can use the modeling technologies available to us, we can take our best guess and balance risks and benefits. And it's important to note that the opportunity costs, so the risks of not doing something, need to be counted, whether that's the risk that our pig populations are decimated by disease, whether it is the animal welfare risk of cattle who are injuring each other, whether it is the human risk of food insecurity. All of those opportunity costs need to factor into this. Okay, so that is a fairly standard approach: weigh risks and benefits, and don't forget that there is a risk of giving up something that we could attain with use of technology. But I want to suggest we need to go one step further, and we need to engage in what I call Cassandra science. We need not just to think about what's likely to happen, but we also need to think about what's the worst thing actually that could happen. How bad is that, and how likely is it? So in other words, we need to take control of those unknowns and try to quantify them, try to qualitatively assess how bad are they, and quantitatively assess how likely is it that this would occur in order to ethically evaluate risks. And I think this Cassandra science, the what's the worst that could happen, is a field that we need further to explore. Okay, the second point I want to turn to is the question about animal welfare and animal interests. So genome editing. For whom is it good? There are some applications of genome editing that, as we've seen, can be, if you like, good for everyone, or at least can be mutually beneficial both to animals and to humans. And so I think Adraldo talked about both of these examples: the cattle who are engineered not to have horns so that they don't injure each other, and pigs that are resistant to disease. Of course, good for humans because they reduce the welfare cost and the economic cost of agriculture, but obviously also good for cows and pigs to be not injured, not to suffer from disease. What I want to think about, though, are some more problematic cases where it's harder to determine what is or isn't in an animal's interests. So stepping slightly outside the field of agriculture, oncomice, for example, are genetically engineered to develop cancer, and this makes them useful model organisms. It makes them useful in biomedical applications to act as models for humans or targets for drug testing. But obviously it's not very good for mice to have cancer. The catch, however, is that these mice would not exist in any other way. So they would not be bred were it not for their usefulness as laboratory animals. So there's a question there about if we are going to create animals who are worse off, but in human interests, but the alternative for those animals is not to exist, whom have we harmed by creating them? And this is a version of a problem that comes up much more commonly when it comes to human genome editing. If you create human children who are somehow worse off genetically, but they couldn't have been created any other way or wouldn't have been created, can you say you've harmed them? So there's a problem there that I'm going to just raise and then put to one side. Another problem, however, is the question of what constitutes welfare and how we define it. So the case of perhaps engineering blind or brain-dead chickens. So the rationale for this is that chickens who are kept in a close quarters, high density environment, such as that found in what's called a battery chicken farm, actually suffer less stress if they can't see other chickens around them. So their lives as battery hens are less worse if they're blind because they can't see. So goes the argument. Ought we then to genetically engineer them to be blind so that their lives within the battery environment are less worse than they otherwise would have been? The extension of this argument is if we create chickens who can not only not see, but perhaps cannot suffer, chickens who are completely brain dead, if you like. For whom is that better? Is this an animal welfare gain or an animal welfare loss to have created organisms that are less capable of suffering, less likely to suffer, or in fact incapable of suffering at all? Now, I think our intuition says it's hard to see how it would be better for a chicken to be blind. But if its welfare is going to be better, how do we reconcile the ethical tension we feel around that? So one argument that's sometimes brought up is around what we call the telos, or if you like, the purpose of the animal, the future purpose of the animal. We could say, well, it's somehow against an animal's intrinsic nature. It's against a chicken's intrinsic nature to be blind or to be brain dead. But when we come to consider what the normative implications of the concept of telos are, we run into some problems. Does an animal's telos relate to which animals we create or how we treat them? Is telos something that can be changed or that should not be changed? If it's morally permissible to alter an animal's telos, then perhaps the whole concept of telos simply collapses to animal welfare. It collapses to interest. So if we want to say, well, it might be in a chicken's nature to wander free and to lay eggs, but if we bred a chicken that was happy to stay at home, that would be absolutely fine. Then actually, we're talking then just about animal interests. If we want to claim that this concept of telos has any normative force outside of interests, we need to say that animals have an interest in doing what they are meant to do. But what is it that they are meant to do? Does this just go back to a naturalistic argument that chickens run around outside, lay eggs, aren't blind, and are eaten by foxes? Is that what chickens are meant to do? So I won't go in detail through this slide because I'm a little short of time. What I want to point out here is that telos becomes a very slippery concept to apply both normatively and even more so in a regulatory sense when we want to say which sorts of changes to animals should or should not be allowed. We run into difficulties when we want to define which capacities are or aren't intrinsic to telos. So perhaps being able to see and being able to run free laying eggs are intrinsic to chickens, but why is, say, plumage color or size of pectoralis major and minor muscles not part of that animal's telos? So we have problems of definition, and we have problems also of what the reference category is. What is the typical the chicken, if you like, the typical chicken or the typical mouse, at whom we should look to determine what a chicken perfectly fulfilling its telos would look like. In the case of the oncomouse, is it the domestic mouse? Is it the wild mouse? Is it C57 black mouse? What's the appropriate reference? What's the appropriate reference for chickens? Is it domestic chickens or wildfowl? And of course, when it comes to humans, are humans or prehistoric humans or perhaps post-humans the appropriate reference category? So telos, I feel, is not a very useful concept when it comes to saying what sorts of changes could or should we make to animals and why or why not. And so I want to turn now to the last concept that I'm going to explore, because I think maybe this helps us answer some of our questions, helps address some of our inquietudes around the apparent idea that actually chickens in a battery environment would be better off blind, humans would be better off because it would reduce our food production costs, and yet, why should we not create blind chickens? Okay, but I'll take a step back and say this is not just about blind chickens, but about societal consequences in general, both local and global. So some of the concerns around the use of genetic technologies and justice revolve around who has control of the technology and how do they use it. Is it the rich? Is it the powerful? Is it the multinationals exerting control over and profiting at the expense of the poor, the local, the technologically disempowered, what I call the Monsanto effect, which of course has had a huge effect on public perceptions around genetic technologies? A too simplistic argument from justice would say that the use of genome editing in agriculture could be inimical to justice and therefore we should not pursue it. But that argument, as I say, is too simplistic. Status quo bias, the idea that we're better off as we are, goes both ways. So a lot of our regulatory approach and a lot of our ethical evaluation is based on, well, it's no worse than what we're already doing. So I said, if instrumentalization is a problem, it's already a problem. If justice is a problem, well, it is already, global justice is already a problem. But we need to get over the idea that we can say, well, it's no worse than what's already happening, so that's fine. We need to ask, could we actually make things better? And actually, this is one of the most underexplored ethical dimensions, I think, of genome editing. Could genome editing in agriculture or in biomedicine help to address existing problems of global justice? Could we combat food security, which we know affects some of the world's poorest in the worst ways? Could we combat food security through genome editing? Could we address the burden of global disease, which again falls disproportionately on those in low income and deprived situations? Could we address that with genome editing? And if we could, rather than a moral reason to avoid genome editing, we might actually have a moral obligation to apply it in these ways. So, if genome editing could help to address existing issues of justice, we have good moral reasons to use it for this purpose. But whom do we consider when it comes to justice? So we think, first of all, about the human populations in other countries. We think about humans who suffer from poor health or who live in poverty. But the One Health concept asks us to recognize that human health, as well as animal and ecosystem health, are inextricably linked. So where do animal interests fit in? Where does animal health fit in to our idea of justice? Can we incorporate these non-human interests? And I want us to end by suggesting that, in fact, we need to think much more about not just global justice, but interspecies justice under the One Health umbrella. So here we're talking about not just animal welfare, not just animal interests, not just the idea that animal suffering and animal benefits count, but whether the allocation of that suffering and those benefits amongst different animals, amongst different species, is justly allocated. And I'll give two examples here to illustrate different aspects of this. So think about domestic dogs, another case where we might say, well, it's humans instrumentalizing dogs for their own purposes. But dogs are actually better off living in a warm house with humans to look after them than they are in the wild. So domestication has resulted in good lives for both humans and dogs. For individual dogs, it's probably better to have domestic properties. So a dog that is well behaved and house trained is probably going to be better off than a dog who's liable to bite people. But the combination of the environment in which these two species, humans and dogs, coexist, and the capacities that those two species have, enables good lives for both, even if not quite equally, in a way that we might say is not unjust. I don't think it is unjust to dogs to live domestically with humans. Blind chickens, on the other hand, have no benefit from their circumstances as battery chickens, save their mere existence. Now, as blind chickens, they might suffer less, and humans benefit. So we might say, well, that's a win-win situation. But within the battery environment, chickens are what we might call systemically disadvantaged. And so even though there's a welfare gain for both humans and chickens from engineering them to be blind, we might still say there is an injustice here, and that's something that we need to address. So I'm going to stop there and leave you with that idea. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for running a bit over time.